In the 1930s, right in the agricultural heartland of Myanmar, you had these peasant farmers who armed themselves with like little more than swords and amulets and sacred tattoos.
Right.
And they took those and they charged directly into British machine gun fire because they were just utterly convinced that their religious beliefs, literally mapped out in ink on their skin, made them physically invulnerable to modern artillery.
It's a staggering historical image.
Yeah, it really is. And to understand how a 2,500-year-old philosophy one that was fundamentally designed by the Buddha to achieve this ultimate undisturbed inner peace, how that could eventually become the psychological armor for a bloody anti-colonial rebellion. We have to look way beyond those serene, half-closed eyes on the statues you see in museums.
Exactly. We have to look at the underlying machinery of human belief itself. I mean, it's the absolute definition of a historical collision, right?
Mm.
Between pure philosophy on one hand and the brutal realities of raw state power on the other.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are opening up this massive and frankly fascinating stack of sources that cover the ancient history, the complex philosophy, and the political sociology of Buddhism. Specifically, we're zeroing in on its evolution throughout Southeast Asia and Myanmar.
Yeah, and our mission here is to really trace the mechanics of that evolution. We're looking at how these teachings morphed and kind of twisted as they collided with sprawling ancient empires and then later with rationalist psychological theories in the 20th century.
Right, and eventually crashing into the desperate math of modern political warfare. But before we start unpacking all of that timeline, we do need to establish a really crucial baseline for you listening right now.
Yes, very important. Because the sources we're working from today, they dissect some deeply entrenched ongoing political and religious conflicts.
Which means we need to be crystal clear. We are remaining entirely impartial throughout this entire deep dive. We take no sides. We are not endorsing any specific theology or orthodox interpretation or political faction mentioned in these materials.
Right, we are simply acting as your guides. Just reporting on the historical and sociological facts contained in the source material, we just want to understand the mechanics of how ideas evolve.
Yeah, how they evolve and how those same ideas get utilized by entirely different groups of people over millennia to achieve their own goals. Because, if we want to understand the modern world, you have to understand how ideologies are built.
And dismantled and, weaponized.
Exactly. So we are going to look at the pragmatic ruthlessness of ancient kings and explore the theories of these radical monks who basically reimagine literal heavens and hells as psychological, states-like stuff you might experience sitting in traffic.
Yeah, and we'll analyze that really sobering sociology of how sacred texts get manipulated to justify extreme violence.
Yeah.
But to grasp any of that modern stuff, we really have to start at the beginning.
Right.
Back when this core spiritual philosophy first crashed into the ultimate historical test, which is, the demands of a sprawling empire.
So to see the origins of that tension, the sources point us to this massive structural shift that happened around the 1st or 2nd century AD. This was under King Kanishka of the Kushan Empire.
Yeah, Kanishka is a huge figure here.
Hmm.
He hosted the Fourth Buddhist Council in Kashmir, and under his patronage, Buddhism underwent this radical transformation. It went from being a fairly localized ascetic tradition into a highly structured imperial religion.
Right. This is when the Mahayana tradition really solidified and expanded, wasn't it?
It was. And the sources detail the specific mechanisms of how they institutionalized it, which I find fascinating.
Yeah.
For one, they adopted Sanskrit as the official language of the texts.
Which is a huge deal because Sanskrit was basically the lingua franca of the elites, right? The scholars and the administrators.
Exactly. So by shifting the sacred texts into Sanskrit, Buddhism could suddenly interface directly with the bureaucratic machinery of the empire itself. It provided this shared intellectual framework to unite a really diverse population.
Wow, so it's like a cultural API for the state.
That is a great way to put it. You also see the flourishing of Gandhara art during this period, those really striking Greco-Buddhist sculptures. The religion became syncretic. It absorbed cultural elements from the fringes of the empire.
Which makes it an incredibly useful tool for state cohesion. The state sponsors the religion, and the religion culturally unifies the state.
Win-win for the king, really.
But to really appreciate why that level of institutionalization was such a massive departure, the sources contrast King Kanishka's approach with this historical heavyweight from a few hundred years earlier. I'm talking about Chanakya.
Ah, yes, also known as Kautilya, the architect behind the Mauryan Empire around 321 BC.
Right. And Chanakya was a Brahmin, meaning he was part of that entrenched orthodox priestly class whose entire social standing relied on maintaining a very strict traditional social order,
And because of that, he vehemently opposed what were known as the Sramana traditions.
which Buddhism originally was, right?
Yeah, exactly. Buddhism, in its original form, was a Shramana tradition. These were the wanderers, the ascetics, people who actively dropped out of normal society, they renounced their wealth, their familial duties, and just retreated to the forest to seek enlightenment.
Which, if you think about it, is an absolute nightmare scenario for an imperial architect. Like, if your entire population decides to drop out of the workforce, abandon their farms, and just meditate in the woods, your tax base collapses overnight.
Totally. You have no surplus grain, and more importantly, you have no young men to conscript into your army.
Right. And Chanakya's famous text, the Arthashastra, it's basically a masterclass in cutthroat statecraft. It outlines how to secure trade routes, crush rebellions, manage spies, and systematically eliminate rival kingdoms.
So the contrast with Buddhism could not be starker. I mean, the Buddhist Dhamma, centered on nonviolence, radical equality regardless of caste, and the rigorous discipline to defeat your internal psychological enemies.
While Chanakya's framework is just entirely focused on securing external wealth and destroying external enemies through, like, whatever Machiavellian means necessary.
Exactly.
It's basically like trying to seamlessly merge a ruthless corporate takeover manual with a grassroots decentralized mindfulness retreat.
Yeah.
How did these two wildly different worldviews even survive in the same political space? They operate on fundamentally contradictory goals.
They do, and that explains the constant rolling historical tension that we see detailed in our sources. Spiritual idealism and state pragmatism just rarely survive together in their pure forms.
Right, something has to give.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Kings like Kanishka recognized the unifying power of the philosophy, but they had to heavily adapt its structure to ensure it served the empire's need for order and hierarchy and wealth. The philosophy survives by adapting to the state.
And the state legitimizes its authority by wrapping itself in the philosophy. But I mean, that adaptation process introduces a pretty glaring vulnerability, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
Because if kings and empires and political councils are constantly tweaking the religion to suit their administrative needs, how do we ever establish what the founder actually intended? I know the sources spend a lot of time on this exact problem of finding the quote-unquote official word.
Oh, finding the unadulterated original message is basically the central puzzle of all religious history. And the sources track this through the lineage of the Buddhist councils.
Right, starting with the first council.
Yeah, the first council convened with 500 senior monks immediately following the Buddha's death. And their main goal was just to recite and memorize the teachings so they wouldn't be lost. But that standardization process, it never really stopped.
It just kept going.
Right. The texts were debated, categorized, and expanded upon for centuries, all the way up to the Sixth Buddhist Council, which Myanmar hosted in Yangon from 1954 to 1956.
Which is wild to think about. The sources also highlight specific texts like the Milindapanha, which records this brilliant philosophical debate involving an Indo-Greek king named Menander. But that text was added to the canon hundreds of years after the Buddha actually walked the earth.
It was, yeah.
So if subsequent generations are continuously appending new philosophical debates and cosmological structures to the canon over, like, a span of 2 millennia, I mean, a skeptical listener might reasonably conclude that we're just looking at a 2,500-year game of telephone.
Right, where the original signal is just totally drowned out.
Exactly, drowned out by the noise of history.
And scholars wrestle with that skepticism constantly. It's a very valid point.
Okay.
However, the consensus outlined in these sociological and historical sources points to a very specific, durable core that did survive centuries of imperial editing.
And that core is the middle way, right?
Yes, the middle way, which encompasses the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and a highly complex mechanism known as dependent origination.
Dependent origination being the fundamental chain of cause and effect. It's the premise that absolutely nothing exists in isolation. Every single phenomenon only arises because of a preceding cause and a specific set of conditions.
Exactly. And to understand the gravity of that concept, you have to look at the philosophical landscape the Buddha was actively dismantling at the time.
Right. The sources describe these two dominant, extreme worldviews that were widely accepted in his era, and he flatly rejected both of them.
Right. So based on the text, the first extreme was eternalism.
Which was the orthodox belief that every person possesses a permanent, unchanging, eternal soul. Under this view, When your physical body dies, this static soul just migrates to a new body. It's like a person taking off an old set of clothes and putting on a new one.
The core identity never actually shifts.
Exactly. And then what was the other extreme?
The opposing extreme was annihilationism. This was the strict materialist, almost nihilistic view that consciousness is literally merely a byproduct of physical elements.
So when the body breaks down at death, consciousness is just entirely annihilated.
Exactly. There's no continuation. There's no moral consequence to your actions after you die.
Yeah.
Just a fade to absolute black.
So the Buddha rejected eternalism because it requires a person to cling desperately to their ego, to this illusion of a permanent self. And he rejected annihilationism because it ignores the undeniable, observable chain of cause and effect that governs the rest of the universe.
Spot on. The middle way navigates directly between those two pitfalls. It proposes that while there is no permanent soul, there is a continuous stream of consciousness driven by the momentum of past actions.
And that ancient consensus on the middle way basically held the tradition together for centuries.
It did.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting, that philosophical baseline fractured violently the moment it collided with the intellectual demands of the 20th century.
Oh, absolutely. As modern science and globalized political thought permeated Southeast Asia, progressive monks found it increasingly difficult to reconcile those first-century cosmological myths with modern rationality.
It forced them into a radical corner.
It did. It sparked what the sources characterize as a rationalist rebellion.
And we see two really prominent figures in the texts spearheading this movement. Mopyar Sayadaw in Myanmar and Buddhadasa Bhikkhu in Thailand. And their shared objective was, well, the complete demythologization of the religion.
Yeah, demythologization. A really helpful parallel for Western history buffs here is Rudolf Bultmann's theological project in the mid-20th century.
Oh, right, with Christianity.
Yeah, Bultmann attempted to strip away the supernatural mythological layers in the New Testament to uncover the core existential truths of early Christianity. And Mopyar and Buddhadasa were attempting the exact same surgical extraction on Buddhist cosmology.
And they focus really heavily on the traditional 31 planes of existence. Because for centuries, everyday practitioners viewed these planes, which include various terrifying hell realms, the animal realm, the human realm, and several tiers of heavenly abodes, they viewed them as literal physical destinations.
Right, like if you accumulated bad karma, you would physically wake up in a subterranean fire pit after you died.
But Mopyar and Buddhadasa argued that interpreting those realms as physical locations was a massive misunderstanding of the original texts. They proposed that these 31 planes are actually granular descriptions of psychological states.
States that human beings experience in the here and now.
Yes. The functional mechanics of their interpretation are just brilliant to me. They're saying hell, or Narak, isn't some fiery cavern waiting for you after a funeral. Hell is the physiological and mental state of extreme anxiety, crippling guilt, and obsessive paranoia that you can trap yourself in on any given Tuesday.
Exactly. And similarly, they argued the animal realm shouldn't be understood as literally being reincarnated into the body of a dog or a bird. To be in the animal realm means you are currently living your human life governed entirely by blind instinct, biological urges, and fear.
Like you're not exercising any moral reflection.
Exactly. And conversely, heaven is simply the profound psychological experience of peace, clarity, and joy in your daily existence.
And to explain how such a massive misinterpretation happened over the centuries, they divided religious terminology into two distinct categories, right?
Yes, this is key. First, you have Fazakon, which translates to everyday human language.
Okay.
This is the realm of myth, metaphor, and simplification. It was designed to help the general masses grasp abstract moral concepts. But then you have Fazatam, which is Dhamma language, or the language of ultimate truth.
So applying that framework completely redefines the central tenet of rebirth. Because if you are operating in Fasakan, that everyday myth language, you think rebirth means a new physical infant being born after a biological death.
Right.
But in Fasatham truth, language rebirth describes the spontaneous birth of the ego.
Yes, exactly.
It is that exact psychological moment when the concepts of I and mine aggressively arise in your consciousness, usually in response to a desire or a threat. Under that definition, a person can undergo the cycle of birth and death 100 times in a single afternoon.
It's a very modern, almost cognitive behavioral way of looking at it.
I find that psychological framework incredibly compelling, honestly. But it does force us to confront a pretty glaring historical discrepancy in the sources.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if Mopiar in Myanmar and Buddhadasa in Thailand were developing and teaching the exact same demythologized rationalist theory at roughly the same time, why is Buddhadasa revered today as one of Thailand's most important modern philosophers, while Mopiar was systematically stripped of his monkhood, publicly accused of heresy, and thrown into a Myanmar prison?
Yeah, that discrepancy exposes the underlying mechanics of state orthodoxy. It actually brings us right back to that dynamic we saw with the ancient empires.
The state controlling the religion.
Precisely. The persecution of Mopiar wasn't primarily a philosophical debate, it was an act of political self-preservation. Myanmar had established the State Sangha Mahayana Committee, which was a highly centralized, state-sponsored governing body for the monastic order.
They basically functioned as the theological police force for the military state, right?
That is exactly their functional role. To maintain control over an incredibly diverse and restive population, the Myanmar state relied heavily on a unified, literalist, and strictly traditional interpretation of the religion. It served as their social glue.
So when Mopiar starts preaching that physical rebirth is a myth?
Right, the state Sangha perceived it as an existential threat to the social order. They formally accused him of annihilationism.
Wow. Which is the exact ancient heresy the Buddha rejected.
Exactly. They argued that if people didn't fear a literal hell in the next life, they would have no reason to obey the law in this one.
Ah, I see.
Whereas Thailand's institutional environment during that specific era possessed enough structural flexibility to absorb Buddhadasa's intellectual critiques. They didn't view it as a direct threat to the monarchy or the state apparatus.
It's just wild. When a state tightly controls and enforces religious doctrine to ensure its own stability, it inevitably teaches the population a dangerous lesson, which is ideology is power. And during the period our sources call the era of ferment in Myanmar, which is roughly the 1920s to the 1960s, the local population realized they could reverse engineer that same doctrine to dismantle the colonial state. We start seeing the rise of anti-colonial pragmatism.
Right, because the British Empire controlled the region at that time, and they were systematically extracting its resources. So the local population was desperately searching for an ideological framework to mobilize some mass resistance.
You initially see the emergence of groups like the YMBA, the Young Men's Buddhist Association, who tried to blend modern nationalism with traditional identity.
But the sources also detail a really fierce Marxist challenge emerging alongside them.
Yeah.
Left-wing writers and critics like Dagon Taya looked at the traditional literalist interpretations of Buddhism and identified them as a major obstacle to revolution.
Because of the focus on the afterlife, right?
Exactly. The Marxist critique argued that an obsession with securing a favorable rebirth in the next life basically bred a paralyzing pie-in-the-sky fatalism. The working class was essentially tolerating severe colonial oppression today because they were promised a metaphysical reward tomorrow.
Which is a devastating critique if you're trying to start a revolution. So to survive that potent Marxist critique, progressive Buddhist thinkers didn't abandon their faith. They radically reinterpreted it.
Right.
Like, we're so used to the classical everyday interpretation of karma as this passive ledger of your past actions. The idea that, you are born into poverty because of a mistake you made 3 lifetimes ago, and there's nothing you can do about it now.
That's the traditional view, yeah.
But these pragmatists weaponize the literal translation of the word karma, which simply means action. They stripped away the passive fatalism and argued that karma dictates that your immediate present-day actions are all that matter.
It's a brilliant pivot.
Yeah. Anti-colonial pragmatism basically meant taking aggressive control of your current actions to force a change in the physical, political reality of the country. You don't wait for the next life, you act now.
And as we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive, that philosophical pivot wasn't just confined to, intellectual debates in university cafes. It manifested as literal physical defense on the battlefield during the Saya San Rebellion in the early 1930s.
Right, the peasant uprising.
Yeah. The global economic depression had devastated rice prices, which pushed the heavily taxed peasantry in Burma to the absolute brink of starvation, and they were facing the full technological might of the British military machine.
And if you're listening to this and wondering how any leader actually talks an impoverished, starving farmer into charging a line of machine guns with a sword, well, the sources point directly to the mechanics of psychological armor.
The technological mismatch was just so severe that the rebellion required an overwhelming ideological counterweight. the peasants underwent these very specific rituals, receiving sacred tattoos and protective amulets. And they generated an absolute, unshakable conviction that these spiritual defenses rendered them physically impervious to British bullets.
The rebellion also leveraged deep mythological symbolism to unite these fractured farming communities, didn't they?
They did.
The rebels branded themselves the Galan, which is the powerful mythical Garuda bird from ancient cosmology, and they strategically cast to British forces as the Naga, the mythological serpent or dragon.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, it elevated a desperate dispute over taxes and land rights into a cosmic, apocalyptic battle between good and evil.
And at the center of that cosmic battle, the population was just desperate for a messianic figure. The socioeconomic structures had failed them completely, so they looked to prophecy.
The Sekhyemen, right.
Yes, they were waiting for the Sekhyemen, a righteous, mythical emperor from Buddhist eschatology who would spontaneously arrive, overthrow the unjust rulers, and restore the moral universe. And Sayasan, who was a former monk and a traditional healer, deliberately positioned himself as the fulfillment of that prophecy to trigger the uprising.
It's just incredible. And that brings us to the final, and I'd say arguably most sobering section of our sources. We are stepping back now to look at the cold, hard math of conflict.
The political sociology of it all.
Exactly. The sociology of how religion and belief systems actually function as instruments of mass mobilization. Because, I mean, when we watch news coverage of religious conflicts today, the immediate surface-level assumption is almost always that the theology itself is the 100% root cause of the violence.
Right. People assume the ancient texts tell group to fight.
Yeah.
And so they just obediently fight.
But sociologists who study the mechanics of mass violence calculate the math very differently. When analysts isolate the underlying variables of these conflicts, they find that the theology is almost never the primary engine.
No, it rarely is.
The foundational root cause is consistently a severe socioeconomic collapse. You are looking at widespread starvation, deep structural inequality, vicious disputes over arable land or water, or just the sudden, massive political disenfranchisement of an entire ethnic group.
Right. Those material conditions usually account for the vast majority of the pressure in the system.
The structural foundation of the society is already cracking under the weight of poverty or oppression.
Exactly. The sources suggest that religion, rather than being the spark, acts as a 20 to 40% accelerant.
An accelerant?
Yeah. It bridges the final gap between a population that is merely desperate and a population that is actually willing to kill.
And the mechanism they use to bridge that gap is known as moral justification. We can almost think of it as a psychological laundering scheme.
Oh, that's an interesting way to phrase it.
Well, because most human beings possess a deeply ingrained biological and social barrier against murdering their neighbors. If a political leader simply stands on a podium and says, I need you to kill the people in the next village so I can consolidate my power and control the local resources, nobody's going to march for that.
No, the psychological barrier holds.
Exactly. But if that same leader introduces religious rhetoric into the equation, they completely change the cognitive framework. They take the dirty, socially unacceptable act of killing a neighbor, they run it through a filter of divine duty, and hand it back to the citizen as a clean, moral imperative.
Right. The conflict is no longer framed as a struggle between starving humans fighting over dwindling resources. It is elevated into a mandatory crusade against cosmic evil.
And that psychological laundering scheme relies entirely on dehumanization. Once you convince a population that they are not committing a crime, but are instead performing a sacred duty sanctioned by the ultimate truth, you completely obliterate the social capital of a nation.
Basic communal trust just evaporates overnight.
Yeah. Any form of critical thinking or attempts at de-escalation are immediately punished by the community as treason or religious heresy.
It is the ultimate corruption of the originating philosophy. When a society decides that a sacred truth is only valuable for its utility in winning a political war, the actual truth is lost entirely. The philosophy is hollowed out and replaced by pure propaganda.
Which leaves us with this profound, tragic irony. The very same philosophy that the Buddha meticulously designed 2,500 years ago as a precise psychological tool to dismantle the ego, cultivate radical empathy, and achieve ultimate inner peace. It ends up being reverse-engineered by blind nationalism and desperation into a mechanism for dehumanizing and destroying your neighbor.
It's heavy.
It is. Let's zoom out and synthesize this journey. We started by watching King Kanishka systematically rebuild an ancient philosophy to serve the bureaucratic needs of a sprawling empire, contrasting that with Chanakya's ruthless blueprint for state survival.
And then we examined the brilliant, albeit dangerous, psychological revelations of modern monks like Buddhadasa and Mopiar. They recognize that the fiery hells detailed in the ancient texts aren't waiting for us underground. They are generated daily in our own anxious, ego-driven minds.
And we finally unpacked the sobering sociological reality of how those same complex belief systems, when injected into an environment of extreme political desperation, are weaponized through psychological armor and moral justification to create literal hells on Earth. It serves as a stark reminder of how incredibly malleable human history and perceived truth can be. The meaning of a text depends almost entirely on the material conditions of the person holding the pen or the sword when they interpret it.
Ultimately, the sources force us to acknowledge that human beings are fundamentally storytelling creatures. The specific myths and narratives we choose to accept, well, they dictate the physical reality we are capable of building.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, building on the framework we just explored. We spent a lot of time discussing how Buddhadasa taught his followers to rigorously separate Fazakan, that everyday myth language, from Fazatam, the actual mechanical truth language, when analyzing ancient religious doctrines.
Right. It's a vital tool for cutting through the noise of any ideology.
Exactly. So take that exact same analytical tool and apply it to our modern, supposedly secular world. Look at the ideologies surrounding you right now.
Whether we are talking about the utopian promises of the tech industry, the foundational assumptions of modern global economics, or the hyper-partisan rhetoric in contemporary politics.
What modern ideologies are you currently accepting entirely in everyday myth language without ever pausing to question the actual mechanical truths operating behind the scenes?
It is a deeply uncomfortable X-ray to apply to your own life, but it's really the only way to ensure you aren't unknowingly wearing someone else's psychological armor.
Because just like that serene, mathematically perfect Buddha statue sitting quietly in the museum, the pristine, polished surface almost always conceals a very complicated and sometimes very dangerous historical scaffolding underneath.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the texts you're handed and keep asking how the machinery actually works. We'll catch you on the next